In the late 19th century, the Kingdom of Korea is at the center of great power rivalries. Japan and China see the Korean peninsula as essential to their security and prestige, and both intervene in Korean affairs. Great power rivalry fuels even more tension. In 1885, Anglo-Russian competition in Central Asia, known as the Great Game, spills into East Asia when Britain briefly occupies a Korean port. The Russian Empire also begins building the Trans-Siberian Railway to link up with its Pacific naval base at Vladivostok, on territory it previously forced China to give up. The Russian presence, Japanese imperial ambitions, and traditional Chinese interests spark a Korea-focused Asian Great Game in the 1890s, a game that drags the region into war. Domestically, Korea is in crisis. Stakes of bitter elite rivalries lead to power struggles within the Joseon dynasty between King Goryeo and Queen Min and the king's father, known as the Taiwan Gun. One of the questions fueling the tensions is Korea's relationships to the outside world. It's known as the Hermit Kingdom for its isolation, even though Korea is formally a tributary of the Chinese Qing Empire. In the 1870s and 1880s, reformers looked to modernizing Japan as a model, while Confucian-minded conservatives value ties with China, and numerous popular rebellions opposed corrupt royal officials or outside influence. China and Japan both worry about instability in Korea. China even tries to impose what some have called a modern form of Qing imperialism in the 1880s, which influential Chinese Viceroy Li Hongzhang sums up this way. For China, Korea is a dependent of China. For all others, Korea is independent. Both China and Japan suffer from unequal economic treaties with Western powers. Both go through mid-century civil wars, and the Chinese also endure humiliating defeats against the British and French. China's self-strengthening movement and Japan's reforms after the Meiji Restoration are both frantic attempts to modernize their economies and militaries, though at the cost of internal tension. By 1894, the Korean carousel of coups and rebellions has left King Kojong at the head of a weak and corrupt government. Meanwhile, a religious movement known as the Tonggaks has gained followers. Founded by Choi Ji-woo, they combine ideas from Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism, in opposition to what they see as the dynasty's moral degeneracy and Western influence. In February, they rise up to protest abuse by corrupt local government officials in the south. Government troops are too weak to deal with the rebels, so the king asks China for help. Beijing sends a small force in June and informs the Japanese as per an 1885 agreement, but only after they've set sail for the port of Asan. Japan considers this a breach of the agreement and sends its own troops. Ironically, the rebellion ends June 11th. China's representative in Korea, Yuan Shikai, proposes a withdrawal, but Japanese Prime Minister Hirobumi Ito is under pressure from hawkish ministers and patriotic newspapers. Ito doesn't want to be seen as too aggressive by the British, since Tokyo and London are about to end their unequal commercial treaty. So the Japanese say that their troops will stay until Korea enacts reforms to deal with the causes of the rebellion. China's top diplomat, Viceroy Li, asks the British, and according to the Chinese diplomatic strategy of using barbarians against barbarians. But they refuse. He wants to avoid war, as he has doubts about China's military readiness, and because he knows the Dowager Empress Cixi has diverted funds from the Navy to build a new palace for her upcoming birthday. Qing Emperor Guangxu, on the other hand, briefly considers war with Japan to overcome the influence of his maternal aunt, the Empress Dowager, but most of his ministers oppose him. He does, however, send more troops to Korea. Tokyo now sees war as inevitable, so on July 19th, its envoy to Korea, Kaisuke Otori, demands that King Kojong expel the Chinese and adopt reforms to show Korea's independence from China. On July 23rd, Japanese troops forced the king to accept the leadership of his father. 2 days later, Japanese warships attacked Chinese naval forces in the Battle of Pengdu, in which the Japanese sink a Chinese cruiser and a troop ship with 1,000 men on board. Beijing declares war on August 1, 1894, and the First Sino-Japanese War officially begins. Many Japanese, even liberal-minded thinkers, greet the war with enthusiasm. Supporters frame the conflict as a clash of the New World versus the decrepit Old Order, or as part of a battle to advance civilization in Asia, an assessment shared by many in the West who hold anti-Chinese views. China is still much larger and has more resources than Japan, and not all Japanese officers are confident. China's military, though, is not centralized, with local governors controlling regional forces, who must plunder from civilians to survive, and who are rarely trained in modern warfare. Li was one of the Chinese reformers pushing for military modernization, and helped create two of China's best armed forces, the Beiyang Fleet, which has 2 German-built large modern battleships to which the Japanese have no equivalent, and the small Y Army, which has modern equipment and some Western training. Japanese forces are better armed, trained, and supplied, and are led by Japanese officers who've studied Western warfighting. For years, Tokyo has reallocated funds from the Imperial Court and into the Army and Navy, and in June 1894 even cracks Chinese diplomatic and military codes. The Japanese plan is to secure their lines of communication in Korea, get control of the Yellow Sea, expel the Chinese from Korea, and then carry the war into Manchuria, and possibly even overthrow the Qing Empire. The Chinese want to surround the Japanese units in Seoul as a first step in maintaining their influence in Korea. But the Japanese are quicker. Japanese troops start moving on July 28th, before the formal start of the war, and they defeat the Chinese in a skirmish at the village of Songwan that night. Chinese General Yi Jiqiao wants to stand at Asan, but he now learns of the loss of expected reinforcements at sea, and faulty intelligence leads him to overestimate Japanese numbers. So the Chinese abandon southern Korea altogether and march 250 kilometers north to Pyongyang, living off the land as they go. The city is well protected by a river, hills, forts, cliffs, walls, and Chinese earthwork defenses. Japanese General Yamagata Aritomo plans to surprise the Chinese by storming the city from all 4 sides. Meanwhile, General Yi reduces patrols after a friendly fire incident, so the Chinese don't detect the Japanese preparations on the landward side. On September 14th, supported by 4 gunboats, the Japanese assault begins. The Chinese don't take the opportunity to hit the Japanese as they cross the river, but they do counterattack fiercely with cavalry charges. The next day, Japanese reinforcements arrive in the hills to the north and join the battle, surprising the Chinese as planned and capturing the city's northern gate. General Yi tells the Japanese he will surrender the next morning, but also orders the garrison to escape overnight. But the withdrawal goes terribly wrong. Shushan describes the panic. Those Chinese soldiers who were in the front were fired upon by the Japanese and started to retreat, but those in the back wanted to rush forward. It was so dark and crowded that one could not distinguish between enemies and friends. So all the Chinese took out their weapons and began fighting each other. Some even killed themselves out of sheer terror. The fragmented Chinese command under 4 generals prevents effective action, and there are rumors that the Chinese Manchu troops fled first, while the Chinese Muslim units fight to the end. The Japanese take Pyongyang in just 2 days, capturing large quantities of weapons, supplies, and horses, and suffering just 160 dead against 2,000 Chinese dead and 700 prisoners, whom the Japanese treat well. Despite the defeats on land in Korea, China's Beiyang fleet still controls the Yellow Sea and access to Manchuria and Korea's west coast. But its commanders make no effort to take the fight to the Japanese. On September 17th, the Japanese combined fleet under Admiral Tsukayuki Ito sights the Chinese by chance near Haiyan Island. Chinese Admiral Ding Ruchang struggles to get his ships into formation. When the Japanese close in and switch from a column to a diagonal line, Ding should react. But instead, his second-in-command, Commodore Liu, spontaneously orders the flagship's main guns to fire. The concussion knocks the unsuspecting Admiral Ding and his British advisor, Vice Admiral William Tyler, unconscious at a critical moment. Tyler later comments on the incident. What was the explanation of the Commodore's act in opening fire while the Admiral and I were standing, well in sight, over the 10-inch guns? I never knew, and I never heard the thing discussed. With the Admiral incapacitated, the Japanese concentrate their fire on the weaker Chinese vessels and set them ablaze. Japanese gunners then focus on the two Chinese battleships, knocking out the communications on the flagship Dingguan. Japanese shells kill so many Chinese sailors they can barely keep their two capital ships in the fight, but they remain afloat. Admiral Ito eventually decides to break off the fight after his flagship is also hit. Chinese officers falsify reports as they had after Pyongyang, a common practice for fear of facing execution. Emperor Guangxu appoints Prince Gong to run the war effort and strips Li's prestigious honors of the 3-peacock feather and yellow riding jacket. And Empress Cixi decides on a modest birthday party. The Japanese have sunk 5 Chinese ships for just 3 damaged of their own, crippling the Beiyang fleet. After 2 major victories within days of each other, the Japanese now push into Chinese territory. In late October, General Yamagata's First Army crosses the Yalu River and moves towards the historical Manchu capital of Shenyang, while General Oyama's 24,000-strong Second Army lands on the Liaodong Peninsula to attack China's most important naval base at Port Arthur. Shenyang is important to the Manchu Qing court, but Port Arthur is militarily crucial as the only base where Chinese ships can be repaired. It's protected by modern forts on the approaches to the city, but the Japanese quickly take them. Japanese land and naval forces surround Port Arthur, and Oyama calls on Chinese General Wei rushing to surrender. Wei's answer is a counterattack out of the town, but the Japanese stop it and capture all the remaining inland forts in a few hours. Superior Japanese firepower, discipline, mobility, and leadership carry the day, just as they did at Pyongyang. The Yellow Sea. A foreign observer recalls the one-sided fight. At the ramparts, not a Chinaman remained. They fled from fort to fort along the high wall, firing as they went, and making a stand at every point till too close for rifle. All over the hills they were chased, and for many miles around, hardly 100 yards could be passed without sight of a Chinese corpse. Chinese commanders disguise themselves and flee, and Japanese troops enter the city November 21st. Until now, the Japanese have behaved well towards defeated enemies, but now Japanese units are gripped by rumors of Chinese soldiers in civilian clothing and of civilians shooting at them. And they're enraged that the Chinese have strung up the heads of Japanese soldiers killed before the city fell. The result is a 3-day massacre inside and outside Port Arthur. Soldier Okabe Makio of the 1st Division writes in his diary, "As we entered the town of Port Arthur, we saw the head of a Japanese soldier displayed on a wooden stake. This filled us with rage and a desire to crush any Chinese soldier. Anyone we saw in the town we killed. The streets were filled with corpses, so many they blocked our way. We killed people in their homes. By and large, there wasn't a single house without from 3 to 6 dead. Blood was flowing, and the smell was awful. We sent out search parties. We shot some and hacked at others. The Chinese troops just dropped their arms and fled, firing and slashing. It was unbounded joy. At this time, our artillery troops were at the rear, giving 3 banzai cheers for the Emperor. Foreign journalists like Canadian James Creelman of the New York World also witnessed the Japanese killing some women and children as well. Estimates of the death toll vary greatly, from 2,000 or 3,000 victims to unlikely claims of 60,000 in some U.S. newspapers at the time. The reports of the massacre put Tokyo's international political goals at risk, since the U.S. Congress is about to debate a fairer commercial treaty with Japan. Japanese Foreign Minister Munemitsu Motsu fears that the new treaties might not be approved if Japan is seen as uncivilized. So Tokyo funds a disinformation campaign in the American and British press to cast doubt on the accusation. The Japanese campaign convinces many American politicians that the reports are overblown. Some American eyewitnesses changed their accounts, and Congress approves the treaty in February 1895. As Japan does damage control in the U.S., in Korea, the Japanese position gets more complicated in the kingdom now, said to have 2 kings. Japan said it started the war to ensure Korea's independence from China, but in practice, it wants control. Japan put the king's father back in power in July, but he and other conservatives opposed Japanese-sponsored reforms. In August, the Taiwan gun asks the Chinese for help. Chinese troops in Korea will provide an occasion for our deliverance. I hope that the Celestial Empire will extend protection to our dynasty and court by sweeping away the traitors in the current regime who are selling the country to the Japanese. He also later approaches the Russian legation and plans to assassinate Japan-friendly Korean opponents. When the Japanese uncover the plot, they promptly remove him from power. The Taiwan gun then calls upon the Tongac rebels to rise up again. Despite divisions between radical and moderate Tongaks, brutal Japanese military requisitioning, and continued abuses by Korean officials convinced them and local peasants to answer the call. On October 12th, the Tongaks declare a general rebellion, which evolves into a messy civil war involving the Tongaks, Japanese troops, government forces, and local government-aligned militias known as minpos. The fighting is brutal, including the traditional practice of beheading or mutilating the dead and scorched earth policies. Chronicler Hwang Hyun describes a rebel attack against government and minpo troops. The minpos were excellent marksmen. The bullets came raining down upon the bandits, and the entire valley was quickly filled with corpses. The next day, however, the bandits mustered their men and entered Hadong, and burned down 10 civilian households, declaring that they would kill all hiding minpo. They then pillaged the nearby villages. Tokyo sends reinforcements, and a 3,000-strong Japanese-Korean government force marches south, smaller but much better equipped than the 10,000 Tongaks, who are spread out and mostly armed with matchlock muskets and bamboo spears. In November and December, Japanese-led forces inflict a series of battlefield defeats on the Tongaks. Another Japanese force moves west from Pusan, trapping the rebels. The Japanese spare few of the enemy. Today we caught 7 Tongak peasants who were left in the village, lined them up in the fields outside of the castle, attached bayonets to guns, and with the command of Lieutenant Morita, stabbed the victims at the same time. The Korean soldiers watching nearby were surprised and shocked. The last Tongdaks, including one of the leaders, Chon Bongjun, surrender in January 1895. But Korea is still bitterly divided. As the Japanese are putting down the Tongdak rebellion, the Qing court is looking to make peace. There is also turmoil in China, as Li's opponents look to capitalize on his defeats, and several generals are executed. In November 1894 and January 1895, Li asks for talks, but the Japanese suspect the Chinese are stalling in the hope that a Western power will intervene, so they remain on the offensive. General Yamagata's move towards Shenyang continues, and he takes Haishan December 13. The Chinese launch numerous counterattacks in the bitter cold, and although they cannot retake the city, they inflict heavy casualties on the Japanese and stop their advance. The Japanese now turn to China's last naval base at Waihaiwai. The Chinese cannot challenge the Japanese on the open sea, but the Beiyang fleet's 4 combat-ready warships might threaten an enemy landing near Beijing. Japanese troops land near Waihaiwai in January and easily capture some of the outlying forts, their guns, and the walled town itself. Only the naval headquarters on Lugongdao Island remains, so Japanese Admiral Ito writes Chinese Admiral Ding and urges him to defect. I believe your wisest course is to come to Japan and wait there until the fortunes of your country are again in the ascent. Will you throw in your lot with a country that you see falling to ruin? Or will you preserve the strength that remains to you and evolve another plan hereafter? Ding does not respond, but tries and fails to retake one of the forts in early February. Japanese torpedo boats then sink the flagship Ding one and another vessel, and Li telegraphs Ding that no help is coming. The admiral negotiates safe passage for his men and then commits suicide. The Japanese honor the agreement, and the Matsushima fires a salute in honor of Ding. Peace talks begin in April 1895 in Japan, but they're interrupted for a week when a Japanese civilian shoots Li in the face. The Chinese diplomat recovers, and on April 17th, the two sides sign the Treaty of Shimonoseki. China recognizes Korean autonomy, agrees to pay Japan a large indemnity, opens several major cities to Japanese trade, and grants Japan the same preferential trade status as the Western power. China also cedes to Japan the Pescadores Islands, the Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur, and the island of Formosa, today's Taiwan. The inhabitants of Formosa, though, rise up against the Japanese occupation in a 5-month insurgency. The First Sino-Japanese War has led to the deaths of about 20,000 Japanese, 30,000 Chinese, and between 30,000 and 50,000 Koreans, devastating the country. The Hansong Sunbo newspaper sums up the tragedy for the people of Korea. The innocent people who were killed are to be pitied, as well as those who are yet alive. For the Chinese, the war shows the failure of modernization efforts and comes as a deep shock, including for Lai. Affairs in my country have been so confined by tradition that I could not accomplish what I desired. Now, in a twinkling of an eye, 10 years have gone by, and everything is still the same. I am ashamed of having excessive wishes and lacking the power to fulfill them. After centuries as East Asia's cultural and political center, China has been easily crushed by a smaller power that had been in its Confucian cultural orbit, which will cause more internal strife and a new push for economic concessions by Western powers. Japanese joy at their victory, new status as a great power, and hopes for equality with the West do not last long. In May, Russia France. They argue that Japanese control of the Liaodong Peninsula is a threat to Korea's independence, China, and Russia. Russian Minister Sergei Witt even threatens military action. Japan's hostile activities on the continent were directed mainly against Russia. The planned takeover of southern Manchuria will be a threat to all of us, and will probably result in all of Korea being absorbed by Japan. If Japan could not be persuaded to relinquish its claim to Liaodong Peninsula, Russia should begin hostile actions against the Japanese fleet and bombard Japanese ports. The so-called Far East is now a central part of international affairs. Tokyo reluctantly agrees to give back the peninsula to China. Japanese public opinion is outraged, even more so when in 1898, Russia pressures China into leasing it, the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur, along with a railway deal in Manchuria. Japanese journalist Soho Tokutomi, once a supporter of liberal principles, wants revenge. Japan will break the global monopoly of the Western race, destroy their special privileges, and bring an end to the special influence and global tyranny of the whites. Japan's plans for dominating post-war Korea also run into a Russian roadblock. Japanese agents assassinate Queen Min and bring back the Taiwan gun, only to see Russia help King Kojong regain power in 1896. The tensions between the Russian and Japanese empires will grow in the following years, until the Asian Great Game explodes into war again. The First Sino-Japanese War is a relatively obscure war that set the stage for many dramatic events of the 20th century, like the Korean War. But it's rarely covered in history documentaries, and its impact is often overlooked. An important reason why we're able to cover lesser-known wars and conflicts here on Real-Time History is your support on Patreon. With a monthly or annual contribution on Patreon, we can go that extra mile with our history document. So go to patreon.com/realtimehistory to support our work directly. If you want to learn more about the Russo-Japanese War just 10 years after the events of 1895, check out our documentary on our sister channel, The Great War. As usual, you can find all the sources for this video in the video description below. If you're watching this video on Patreon or Nebula, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real-Time History, the only history channel that fights barbarians with barbarians.